So I want to talk today about some ongoing work that I've been doing now for a number of years, exploring the spatial, affective and material aspects of social inclusion. Now, social inclusion is one of those ideas that has generated a great deal of attention in the social sciences, has been presented as a particularly effective response to a whole host of social problems, and yet it's never quite clear what it means. It's never quite clear the social aspects that one might hope to be included in, and it's never quite clear in what way social inclusion might be regarded as somehow healthy, for example, enabling or beneficial. And so if I think about the work that I've done in relation to homelessness, addiction and mental illness issues, it's often presented as if social inclusion is an incredibly powerful and important protective factor for young people. But again, how it protects young people, the particular aspects of social life that might be regarded as therapeutic or enabling, for example, how that works, but more importantly, how to find ways to promote social inclusion for people who are excluded. So those aspects are always a little unclear. And this is the reason why I found David Harvey's version of the right to the city particularly interesting, because it frames, although he doesn't talk about it this way, it frames the idea of the socius or the city, urban life, social life in some interesting ways. But I think it frames it in terms of rights, and that's quite compelling and quite different from how it's normally treated in the social sciences. The idea of social inclusion is normally treated in social sciences. So the key question then is, what kind of a right is the right to the city? Why might talking about social life in that way be helpful or illuminating somehow? Who gets to enjoy this right? How is the right conferred? How is it that some people come to be disenfranchised of this right? How can it be restored? Now, in talking about Harvey's work, the criticism I want to make of this is that he reifies the city. What kind of a city is it that Harvey's interested in? He talks about Paris, he talks about London, he talks about Shanghai, as if these cities are interchangeable somehow, or they share some common features that are taken for granted in important ways. So I want to talk about the city in a particular way, borrowing from the work of the philosopher of science, Manuel Delander, who talks about assemblages and machines in particular ways. But the bit that I'll pick out of his work is around the idea of capacities. So he talks about cities as being machines that generate and distribute capacity. So I'll talk about what that might mean and why it might be useful. In introducing some of these theoretical concerns, I'll then try and ground this work in some of my own ongoing ethnographic research conducted among young people experiencing homelessness, addiction and mental health problems. And I'll talk about SMI, as severe mental illness, by the way. And I'll talk about how and why this idea of social inclusion or the right to the city might be interesting in relation to people who are probably most fairly characterised in terms of social exclusion. So again, the notion really across the social sciences for scholars interested in addiction and mental health issues, social inclusion is almost always assumed to be beneficial or helpful somehow, healthy, enabling, therapeutic. And so typically that's run as a counter to social exclusion. The idea is young people are marginalised, they're socially excluded, part of their recovery, part of them getting over or getting on with their lives can be promoted via this idea of social inclusion. So we could say, in terms of the theoretical constructs that I want to work with today, that we could talk about social exclusion in terms of the extent to which it limits access to social, affective and material capacities. So I'll talk about, again, that in some more details. What I'd like to close with, though, is recasting this right to the city in affective terms, and I'll talk about what that might mean and why it might be useful. So first I'll talk about David Harvey's idea of the right to the city. So this is borrowed from Henri Lefebvre. And it mainly talks about the idea of the city, and Harvey talks about the city as a particular aspect of modern life, particularly important aspect of how our economies are organised, obviously. And he talks about cities in terms of what he calls surplus absorption. So he's a Marxist geographer and he tends to talk about cities and material production in those sorts of terms. So partially Harvey's idea of the right to the city is a right to what already exists in cities. And so partly this is a fairly conventional argument for access to the sorts of material infrastructure that cities generate, the kind of wealth that cities generate, material values and so forth. Now where I think this gets a little bit more interesting is that Harvey also talks about the right to change the city after our heart's desire. Now it's quite interesting for a Marxist geographer to talk about heart's desire, I think. This is quite interesting to me. This is one of those aspects that really jumped out at me the first time I read this piece. What could the right to change the city after our heart's desire really mean? And why might that be interesting? So he talks about, and elaborating on this point, he talks about the idea, the right to remake ourselves by creating a qualitatively different kind of urban sociality. Now again, why would a Marxist geographer be interested in that? remaking a qualitatively different kind of urban sociality. Now, in my mind, that's an interesting way of talking about social inclusion that has a kind of penetrating insight, I think, that goes well beyond how it's ordinarily talked about in sociology, for example, or in youth studies. So, partly, Harvey talks about this idea of a differential right to access the material surplus produced and partially redistributed in cities and across urban populations. So this aspect of it is fairly familiar. Cities generate surpluses. They attract surplus, they distribute surplus. Surplus of people, surplus of money, ideas, etc., etc. Flows, if you like. So this much, I think, is reasonably clear. This is probably akin to how we ordinarily think about cities and the way they tend to be characterised by the concentration of particular kinds of flows. People, ideas, capital. So this much is clear, I think. But as I said, the aspect of Harvey's analysis that is much less clear to me is what exactly is the city? Now, it's striking for me, for a geographer, to be less interested in the empirical aspects of cities. How can we characterise and define cities? How do they change over time? How can we research cities as an object of empirical inquiry? So as I said, Harvey casts the city as a mode of surplus absorption. So that's interesting to an extent. But I don't think it's a very familiar city. So if we're interested in the kinds of cities that young people inhabit, they wouldn't typically understand the city in those terms, but I don't know that it's an especially useful way for thinking about the sorts of a city life that young people experience, particularly young people who are experiencing social exclusion, mental health and addiction issues. So I want to start with really interrogating this idea of what the city might be and how we can come to study it. So cities have long occupied the critical imaginary, and this idea of imaginary is really important because I think you can follow Benedict Anderson and think about cities as imagined communities, but this imaginative, the imaginary aspect of city life is very important, I think. So I think what we find in the literature on cities is this enduring tension. So we've come across cities as sites of promise and disorder. So again, I've got two contrary examples here to illustrate that point. So we think first about Richard Florida's much-cited work on the rise of creative classes in cities, so the idea of the creative city. And I think what you find in Florida's work, and we can pass this to some extent, but I think what we find in Florida's work, that the three T's, this idea of creative cities are characterised by talent, tolerance and technology. So what you find in Florida's work is a fairly unvarnished account of the creative capacity of cities for regeneration, but also the extent to which cities, as they prosper, they can draw in populations, they can generate wealth, they can generate prosperity and sustain prosperity. So in a sense, Florida's argument is an account for how to rejuvenate cities, and it's really taken off in that respect as a model for, particularly in inner cities, for kind of rejuvenating the city, for stimulating economic growth and so forth. So here we have an account of the city, a fairly positive, productive account of the city that emphasises talent, tolerance and technology. So this is really the idea of the city as creative and cosmopolitan. But I think contrary to that, we also have in the literature, particularly in public health, when you think about public health as it's born as a discipline, it's really founded on the idea of cities as risk environments. Cities are risky, dangerous, dirty places. Cities are places in which diseases are transmitted very readily. Cities are places in which bad habits proliferate. Cities are really dangerous, unhealthy places. And I think in a lot of social theory, we see a version of this, the idea of the dangerous city as well, sites of enemy and alienation, loss of social capital and disadvantage. So this idea of cities as indifferent, competitive, hostile, harsh environments. So I think thinking about cities, we tend to think about them with this tension in mind. We recognise the cosmopolitan character of cities, we recognise the tolerance of difference that cities are famed for, but we also recognise this other aspect of cities, perhaps as dangerous, unhealthy, disadvantaged places. But the point here, I think, borrowing from Manuel Delander, the philosopher of science I mentioned, is that these are both imaginaries of urban life that tend to reify the cities in certain ways. Now, what actual aspects of cities do these ideas refer to? Because, of course, we could say, we take the easy way out and say, well, all cities are a mix of these characteristics. But then the question becomes, well, to what extent do they mix these properties? How do these properties change over time? What are the historical social forces that act upon cities? How are cities made, reinvented, reimagined? So these are imaginaries of urban life that I don't think are especially helpful, and I think that we see them at work in David Harvey's work. We see this idea of the city as a particular kind of entity, which doesn't necessarily help us understand actual cities. If we walk out this afternoon down to Swanston Street, what city do we encounter downstairs? What city is this outside? So Delander would argue that there's no macro city, there's no reified object of history, there is no capital C city. And if there is, it's not especially helpful, and it doesn't particularly pertain to any actual city that's ever existed. So in his book, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, DeLander talks about cities in terms of their capacity to generate and distribute capacities, the extent to which cities are characterised by the production and distribution of capacities, social capacities, material capacities, affective capacities. Now, I was trying to think of a useful example of this, and I was thinking about the university, urban universities, as a particular unit of analysis, a particular organisation that distributes capacities. And we can think about some of the obvious ones. Universities have a capacity to confer a degree. That capacity is upheld at law, is subject to a whole host of professional and technical aspects, but the university itself, particularly urban universities, they distribute particular kinds of educational capacities, social material capacities, but then we think about the social life of universities that distributes a particular set of values as well. So I guess borrowing from Deleuze, Martin mentioned this, so we could talk in more Deleuzian terms about the extent to which cities link bodies, both human and non-human, in the production of capacities. Now this might be unfamiliar, this kind of theoretical account of cities, but I hope that in the course of the next 20 minutes or so, I'll provide some examples of what this might mean and why it might be useful. The key thing here, I think, is that the distinction Deleuze would draw is between the idea of possible experience and real experience. So cities in reified terms describe the possible account of urban life. I'm interested in the real account of human life. And the reason for that, as I'll come to show in some of the examples soon, is that we need to understand in real experience how cities generate these sorts of capacities if we want to include people in cities, if we want to enhance and extend the right to the city. So if cities link bodies, human and non-human, in the production of capacities, what's the right to that kind of city? So to return to Harvey's ideas for some insight into this, the right to the city. Harvey's right to the city is primarily legal and social. At bottom, Harvey is talking about the right to the city in fairly familiar terms. Ultimately, he's about opening up, I think, the right to the sorts of material functions, material wealth that cities generate. So this is also a social right, a collective power to reshape the processes of urbanisation to make and remake our cities and ourselves. So in some respects, there's a politics at work in Harvey's writing, of course, an account of the city that's about a collective demand for more access to the city, an extended, enhanced right to the sorts of surpluses that cities generate. So this is the right to change the city after our heart's desire. This is the kind of politics at work in Harvey's writing, this idea of a collective organisation to demand more of the city, greater access to the city. But as I've mentioned, this is still a reified city of surplus absorption, this idea that cities become nodal points in global flows. They become points at which surpluses accumulate. They absorb that surplus, they extract it from a material, social and geographical hinterland, they absorb resources, concentrate those resources in the hands of a few, and then collectively decisions are made about how those resources are put to work. What I think this ignores, though, following DeLander's work, is that we don't really understand much of the life of the city in this writing. If we think about cities in terms of surplus absorption, then we miss a lot of the social life of cities. I think we miss much of what we find walking up and down Swanston Street, for example, and that's the affective and relational co-constitution of the city. How are cities made? What are cities as objects of human interaction, of non-human interaction? How are they made? How do they change over time? So this is the affective and relational co-constitution of the city. How are cities made in everyday life? So the question then becomes, to what extent can Harvey's account of the city help us to understand this affective relational aspect of the city? And I think it can't. So I would make an argument for recasting the right to the city in affective terms. The point here is that we need to understand the city as an affective project, the extent to which it's livable, safe, creative, cosmopolitan. Cities are affective projects that are constantly in the process of being made and remade. This is the city that generates feelings, desires, the socius as a felt community. The idea of the community is something that we feel, we understand, we have a capacity to change that we contribute to. And I think this is the most important capacity that cities generate, the socius, as Deleuze would say, the felt connection to a population, a community, sense of meaning, belonging and purpose. Now that's also how we can understand social exclusion and how we can help to understand what is lost for people who are excluded from that. fucked the slides up, didn't I?
Got me on film now.
Okay, great. Profane as well. Okay. So, describe cities as assemblages that generate and distribute diverse social, affective and material capacities. Now, the key thing here, I think, is this helps us think about inequality and social exclusion. Social exclusion is effectively happens when people are withdrawn from the flow of capacities in cities. They are disabled, that the access is denied for people to this flow of capacities. So I think this provides an interesting way of thinking about disadvantage, social inclusion and marginalisation. And this is why I think the shift to rights is potentially really useful, because we typically think about social exclusion in terms of participation. So the idea that people are excluded from participating in the life of their community, from employment, from training, from these sorts of things. And sometimes we talk about a right to employment, a right to a job, but that's not all that common. And this is why I think the talk of rights might potentially be quite useful. So Harvey talks about a collective power to reshape the processes of urbanisation. So what could that mean? To make and remake our cities and ourselves. So I want to argue that this project of remaking cities, of remaking selves, can be usefully understood as an affective project by way of Michael Hart's discussion of affective labour. This is the work of transforming cities. What does that work look like? So in terms of social inclusion, we could talk about what's the work of inclusion, what's the work of transformation, what's the work of creativity. If we think about this idea of urbanisation, of making and remaking ourselves, this is a creative project. To what extent is it creative? How can we understand the work that goes into making and remaking cities, transforming processes of urbanisation? How can we understand this work? Again, the shift I'm trying to make is to move from the idea of a kind of theoretical generality, processes of urbanisation, to an understanding of the real everyday work of making and remaking social interaction in cities. And I found Hart's discussion of affective labour especially useful in this regard. So if we can think about the city as being made, processes of urbanisation are made in this affective labour, what's the right to that kind of city and who gets to exercise it? So I wanted to talk about cities. I've been talking about the idea of the real experience of cities, so I thought I'm going to do a little case study of Swanston Street. Now, most of us are really familiar with it. We spend time in Swanston Street every day. So what kind of city life do we find here on Swanston Street? So I'll start with the kind of more iconic aspect of Swanston Street, the State Library. So here we have an account, an instance of the affective labour of making the city. This is a process of urbanisation here, going on every day, all day. Now what's the affective labour at work here? Partly the affective labour of community. Presumably, we have a cohort of RMIT students, Melbourne University students, visitors, tourists. This is the work of making and remaking the city. What kind of city is Melbourne? Is it welcoming of tourists? Is it welcoming of students? Who gets to spend time on the lawn outside the State Library? Who gets time to enjoy the buskers? What kind of city is this? How does it change over time? Victorian architecture, the kind of account of colonial Melbourne, gold rush Melbourne. We can read the kind of human, non-human interactions at work here. And this provides us with a sense of the city, but also more importantly, I think, the everyday real experience of making and remaking the city. The other end of Swanston Street. This is the Grand Final Parade. I pinched this from The Age, a photo from The Age last year. Grand Final Parade. Swans versus Hawks last year. Now we can argue all day about the role of AFL in the city and whether that's too great a role or too diminished a role, whether that's changing over time, but unquestionably, we have a sense of the right to the city here. We have a public holiday now for this. For a horse race and for a game of football. Wow, how does that happen? I mean, that's incredible. I mean, we also have a holiday for someone's birthday, but it's, this idea that this is the life of the city, that we can close down the major thoroughfare in the city for people to watch groups of very fit young men parade in motor cars up and down the street. It's great for the kids, right? But so the affective labour here, we have a really powerful sense of particular kinds of communities here in Melbourne. Now, the great thing about sport is that in this country it's pretty cross-sectional, right? I mean, this is really a sort of slice of Melbourne life, for better or for worse. So what we generally find here is that, I think what's remarkable about Grand Final Day is that it's very rarely marked by any kind of problem whatsoever, this parade. So that's quite incredible, I think. So we get this kind of celebration of something in Australian life, something in Melbourne, that feels quite distinctive. Now this just makes me happy.
Did you see this today? Or?
So this was, I took this photograph on Tuesday night. So what? Outside the State Library. So the first thing is, let's just allow ourselves to ponder the sentiment here. I just love how, as if anyone was in any confusion about this, it's, and I'll make use of the pointer because I've got it. Again, then signed Sherlock Holmes, just for a bit of undergraduate humour, I guess. So I'm guessing that, news spreads on Monday night, someone's come and scrawled this outside the State Library on Tuesday. But what's really interesting about this is, can you really imagine that happening the day after Kevin Rudd was deposed? Would someone be so excited about it that that happened? So there's something about Melbourne, something about the kind of assumption about that I feel so excited about this event that I have to, scrawl it on outside the State Library. And that the idea that that would be kind of uncontroversial, and that, I don't know how long it took someone to do that, but probably a couple of minutes, that no one stopped and said, this is a terrible, terrible thing that's happened to us, how dare you do that? People probably, I wasn't the only one who took a photo of this, you know what I mean? I was waiting for my tram, 4 or 5 people took photos of that. So that again, it's, this is the affective labour of making and remaking the city, where this is a shared sentiment, a shared value. This is the affective labour bit, the shared value, but also the sense that there's a community of people around us who share that sentiment too, and so this is uncontroversial. Now, those of you who have spent time on Swansea Street recently will have seen this a lot as well. I've lived in Melbourne for 15 years. I don't remember this even at the, I know we didn't really have a recession at the end of the global financial crisis, but there's economic downturns. I don't remember this as much.
Yeah, when I was young, it was like that.
Yeah, okay. But yeah, so that's the idea, isn't it? That where do these people come from? Now, we've talked about this as an affective labour as well, because I did lots of projects on homelessness in Vancouver, which has a much more extensive, visible street homelessness population. And we were kind of primarily interested in, I was working for the health authority at that stage, the work that goes into sustaining what we call rough sleeping in this country. The work that goes into simply existing in this way. And so I mean affective labour because what's really fascinating about this, now Florida talks about tolerance in cities. Now I presented this idea recently at the Regional Studies Conference and someone said maybe indifference is a better word. And I thought, yep, that really is. Because what we find here is that this is up and down Swansea Street. So I went and got my lunch today, past 4 or 5 people like this, along with, 5,000 other people? Up and down Swansea Street. So this kind of affective labour of indifference. Now we could call that tolerance of a kind. We're not intervening. And I think it's really interesting. The other aspect of this that's quite fascinating is if you kind of sit and observe this for a period of time, I've got ethical clearance to do this, so what you see is that all sorts of interesting communities at play here. Partly around people, and since I did a project on this in the City of Melbourne 2 years ago, lots of interesting work going on around the idea of the distribution of resources. So what you see is lots of discussions about where to access cheap food or free food, where the vans are going to be, how to access healthcare, where you can kind of panhandle outside train stations, which are the most generous train stations. So apparently Parliament is the best. Where you can pass the time as well. Lots of kind of discussion about, where are the most interesting places to pass the time. So Swansea Street has had this reputation for being places where people will stop and have a conversation with you. So I've called that the affective labour of exclusion, but it's, I think, a bit more complicated than that. I'm also interested in how our cities get marked by particular kinds of forms of inhabiting the city. And we're seeing this increasingly on Swansea Street. So we've got a different kind of affective labour at work here as well. And again, we see this up and down Swansea Street. Now, we could say that there's a great deal of indifference going on here, but what we also find, and I did this yesterday afternoon, I sort of sat around and watched for a little bit of time, and what you tend to find is, again, lots of people stopping. Sometimes people just dropping coins as they're walking past, but lots of people stopping. sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask how people are. So there's an affective labour of kind of making the city, and I'm kind of interested in this. Presumably people are excited about that because we kind of link those two things somehow. You know, there's a sense that, well, here's a Prime Minister that isn't at all concerned about this and has done a great deal to make that more likely to happen. Now that would be kind of my reading of it, my sense of it. Probably mostly ill-informed, but you know, that's my sense. But I'll kind of link those two things. But that's, I think, in Melbourne you've got a sense that we're kind of excited about that because we think, someone's going to do something about this, or that we won't have a government that's so indifferent to this. Now, I think we've got a great tradition in this country of assuming that our government's going to fix social problems so we don't need to worry about them. But still, there's some interesting things happening on Swanston Street that make it an interesting way of thinking about what is the city and how is it being remade every day. So, there's something useful in Harvey's idea of the right to the city. But it needs to be augmented, if you like, with this idea of affective labour. Because I think we need to understand what the city is that we want to have a right to. If it's simply a right to material surplus, then are we actually talking about the right to the city, or are we talking about a right to a welfare state? Wouldn't that be just a simpler way of talking about it, to defend the older project of the welfare state? If we're talking about something else, that there's something in cities that are innately dynamic, interesting, energetic, then what's that city, where is it, and how could we broker a right to it? And that's where I think affective labour is really interesting. So I think it also provides some interesting insights into the social aspects of homelessness and addiction. Because in a sense, we could talk about homelessness, addiction, severe mental illness in terms of a kind of problematic relationship to the city, a problematic relationship to the kind of affective labour that goes into making cities. So in the literature on homelessness, there's this idea that's been around for a long time that one way of addressing homelessness, one way of addressing mental health problems, one way of addressing addiction is to increase somehow, to promote social inclusion. Now what you tend to find in that literature is this idea that being included in a community is somehow innately therapeutic, that there's something about having connections with other human beings that is innately therapeutic, and that the more of those connections, the better. Now occasionally you see critiques of social capital along those lines, this idea of, well, what is it about social connections that is therapeutic? How does it actually work? And if you are being diagnosed with schizophrenia, for example, why would having more friends make your life better? There's a lot of work in addiction, for example, that talks about social connections are actually mainly unhealthy. That social connections are primarily a big part of maintaining habits, maintaining patterns of drug use over time, accessing markets, these sorts of things. So, bearing those sorts of critiques in mind, I think still there's something useful in thinking about social exclusion, thinking about social inclusion in terms of affective labour, in terms of a right to the city. So I think why this is interesting is I think that Harvey's right, that the right to remake ourselves is fundamental. The right to remake ourselves in cities is crucial. The right to remake ourselves is an aspect of how we exercise our own right as citizens, how we participate in the life of our community, how we remake ourselves. I mean, these are really important aspects of the way we live our lives in cities. And it's true, of course, that those sorts of rights are very unequally distributed, very unequally observed, like almost all other rights. So if we think about why social exclusion is a problem and why social inclusion might be important, I think that it's partially about this idea of we need to ensure that the right to remake ourselves is as open as possible. But I think perhaps more crucially in terms of how we characterise cities, we could talk about the right to the city as a right to share in the generation and distribution of capacities. So how can we restore that kind of right? So another aspect of why I think this idea of affective labour is interesting is that again, I said before that oftentimes social inclusion is just sort of assumed to be useful or good or therapeutic or beneficial without much sense of how it works, why it's beneficial, or how it could be promoted. So if we think about responses to homelessness and addiction, again, a lot of responses, policy responses, emphasise social inclusion and recovery. So a national mental health plan, for example, promotes social inclusion as a very important aspect of promoting recovery among people experiencing mental health problems. So there's a sense that social inclusion is crucial. But again, how do we promote belonging? How do we promote empowerment? How do we promote connectedness? And I've worked in situations like this in Vancouver where this is the idea of, so my job in Vancouver was about designing and developing a strength-based approach to the delivery of addiction and mental health services. So how do you promote strengths? One aspect of the idea of sort of personal capacities, this is the idea of social connections, the richness and diversity of social connections. So if we're talking about young people who typically don't have strong and diverse social networks, how do we promote those things? How do we do that? So, in some respects, I think the problem here is that we don't really have a strong handle on how to promote the work of social care. If we think about social inclusion, if we think about homelessness and addiction in terms of social care, the work we need to do to promote social care, I think this idea of affective labour can help us understand what that work entails and how it can be extended. So I want to now offer a couple of examples of what I think this affective labour looks like for people who have experienced social exclusion. So I'll run through these quotes fairly quickly. So we can talk about methods and research designs later if people are interested in that, but I thought I'd start with some of the material itself. So these are projects that try to understand the experience of social inclusion, experience of social exclusion for young people experiencing homelessness, addiction, or mental health problems. And so partly these studies are about the idea of finding the city. If the idea is that social inclusion is important for people experiencing these kinds of problems, and I was really interested in what is the social that people are being included in. Now some of these things are very familiar, and I've started with a familiar example. Robert talks about a cafe that was important to him. First coming here, it was really instrumental for me in restoring my ability to socialise with people. I'd meet people regularly who would come every time the same time, and you build up this non-threatening little community, and it's a relaxed atmosphere. You'll be sitting there and another regular comes along, you have a yarn, and sometimes get into these really philosophical discussions. Now that's the affective labour of making and remaking the city. Now of course Robert wouldn't talk about it that way. He might be bemused at me talking about it this way. But what we have here is an account of the social life of the city and how people find a way back into the city. Now Robert, fairly familiar story, diagnosed with schizophrenia at 21 or thereabouts, goes through a long period of all sorts of problems, drug and alcohol misuse, estranged from his family, gets some treatment in his mid-20s, starts to get a little bit better, manages his medication a little bit better. Now, at 29, he's coming to experience Melbourne afresh. And he would talk about it that way, the sense of, he talks about this idea of, he wouldn't use these terms, but a kind of biographical gap, this sort of sense of, it's a period of his life that he just can't account for. Nothing much happened other than him getting unwell. Gets a little bit better. Now, Robert is kind of re-entering, remaking the city for himself. Mary. I have my retail therapy here. This is therapy for me, absolute therapy. You can find the most amazing stuff here for $5 or $10, stuff I need for the house or just stuff I might need one day. I love it. If it closes down, I would be so depressed. It's like heaven, really. This is the West Meadows Bridge op shop, by the way. Heaven, really, and it always boosts my mood. My endorphins go sky high here. So, it's kind of fascinating as a qualitative researcher when you hear people talk about things that way. My endorphins go sky high here. Similar kind of story. This is a story of social exclusion. So this is about finding a way back into the city. And Mary talked mainly in this instance about the staff at this particular shop and the sorts of people who would spend time there. Now the big thing in both of these examples is that there was never any pressure to move on. And people talk a lot about that, this idea that they're constantly feeling like when they're in the city, there's pressure to move on. Coming into the city, constantly sort of feeling like you've got to keep moving, you can't linger anywhere. So when people find places where they can stay, where they can linger, this is very powerful. Adam in Footscray. I love that I have all these shops close by the bus too. I'm always discovering new things and it feels like a whole world is here, people from everywhere. I can grab a juice or buy a book from a secondhand store, sit in the mall and watch the world go by. I'm surrounded by people and it always makes me feel better. So again, we've got a sense here of a kind of atmosphere in this mall. Now this is the city being remade for Adam. So what's the affective labour involve? Mainly, very mundane things. Buying a book, buying a juice, sitting in the mall and reading a book. Now again, people who have experienced social exclusion, who have experienced hospitalisation for mental health problems, I mean, this is a very profound thing indeed. Again, the capacity to linger and a feeling of being welcome, or at least feeling like there isn't a pressure to move on. It is. I've always loved the botanical gardens, even as a child, but ever since I was diagnosed, it has just been so important for me. It makes me feel alive again. The greenery, all the plants, all that life all around. And the silence too, like I can just sit and watch things go by, it makes me happy. So again, a feeling of here is the city for Liz. Here is the city being made in a process of connection with place. Historical connection that gets reimagined as the work of recovery advances. Rick. This is my place. It's peaceful, secure, a really good feeling, you know, because I've lived rough in the past on the streets. It's different here in my room where I have my futon, my DVD player, and my CD and radio and stuff. They're all here in the same little corner. So I don't have to go anywhere. I'm better now that I have a place to call my own. It's an anchor for everything else in my life. Now that's a very familiar account of home. And why I've included it is that the city starts from this brokering of access to space. So Rick has been homeless. The right to privacy, the idea of access to a private space, was denied to him for a long period of time. So the city, in the absence of privacy, becomes a very hostile, uncomfortable place. Now, what's privacy all about? For Rick, partially about material security, but an anchor for everything else. It's the idea of a private space. Now, Rick talks a lot about the privacy that you need when you're very unwell. And this was really striking, but I hadn't really thought about it this way, and it certainly hasn't appeared in the literature much. But this idea of the right to be excluded. Rick had no problem with the idea of social exclusion. He really wanted it that way. Mainly, he felt like his problem was that he never had enough privacy to experience his own illness in his own way. He felt like he was constantly being scrutinised. His behaviour was constantly being scrutinised by medical health staff, by people in the street all around him. So he never felt like he had the right to privacy to experience his own illness in his own way. So when I talked to Rick about the city, Rick wanted private space. He wanted a space where he could experience himself just the way he was. And he talked a lot about this idea of this sort of symptomatic experience of mental health, the problems he went through, and the idea of how he felt like managing those symptoms in private all the time, the things that he wanted to do to manage those symptoms. So here we have a city that's drawn for Rick inside the four walls of this room. Now, we conducted an interview on the rooftop of this apartment block, and Rick was really happy moving back and forth between his apartment and the rooftop. He would go out every now and again to get food. He had support staff from one of the local mental health services that would come and bring him things a lot of the time as well. Peer team that would visit him from time to time. But his city was mainly kind of up and down the stairwell, up to the rooftop, back to his room. As far as I could tell, he seemed genuinely happy with that, given the experience that he'd had leading up to that. So, what I think these vignettes illustrate is part of the affective labour of making and remaking the city for people who don't have the kinds of resources that we enjoy to experience urban life the way we do. So, this is the social, affective and material labour involved in making and remaking the city. Partially, the city is about experiencing a place of expression. So we find Rick, this was really important for Rick, but not the expression that we might think of. You know, Rick wanted to find a place to express his illness in a particular way. Liz wanted a place where she'd experience some kind of natural sanctuary in the city. So in Robert's Cafe, we have this idea of an experience of sociality, access to an atmosphere of belonging, a sense of tolerance, absolutely. Most importantly, space of disclosure. The city is kind of affective labour that's involved in disclosing oneself. Robert talked a lot about this cafe. What he liked about it was that no one ever asked him what he was doing there at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. You know, this idea of, you know, why do you come here during the day so much? Robert talked about other places where people eventually asked him, you know, do you work? You know, what do you do? And this particular cafe, the Sphere Cafe, was important for Robert because that aspect of disclosure didn't come up very often. He said that people were happy to talk about other things. He also started playing chess with one of the staff members there, and that's just this sense of This is my city here. This is the affective labour of making the city, remaking forms of urban sociality, remaking a self, a healthy self, maybe an unhealthy self, a particular kind of self. So the point here is that these are not trivial examples. So it points to how the task of making and remaking the city can address health and social problems. Because the point here is that if we think about social inclusion has to be made out of all of these things again and again and again, every day, continuously, over time. We can talk about work, we can talk about training. These things are critically important, absolutely. But this is what the city means. This is what social inclusion means. Finding a space like this and then returning to it, returning to the affective labour of inclusion over and over again. Coming back to this place again and again. This is how the city is made, a particular kind of city. My city, the city is a particular affective infrastructure. Here it is, I'm participating in it. If that connection is broken, if it's lost, the city is transformed for the worse. Same here. Access the space, access the city, make it, change it, experience it, become well in it, feel included in it, form connections in it. This is the city. This is Adam's city. Liz's city, the atmosphere in this garden. This is a particular kind of affective labour of making a particular kind of feeling state and then using that feeling state to do other things, to feel better, to feel happy. You can imagine an experience of a depressive illness. You know, subtle modulations in mood state become critically important. How can you do that? Where do you get it? How do you get it again? If you wake up in the morning and you feel down, we've talked about this a lot, and you wake up in the morning, you start to feel a certain way, what do you do about it? We talked about this kind of affective labour of constant vigilance over mood states. Slightest modulation, slightest fluctuation, slightest changes. What can I do before this kicks in? What can I do before it gets worse? Simply affording privacy. How can I make privacy? What is privacy? All of us take it for granted. Well, I used to. Now I have a 3-year-old that knocks on the door when I'm doing a poo. You didn't need to know that, but it's, you know, it happened this morning.
That's what 3-year-olds do.
That's what 3-year-olds do. You know what? He talked to me for ages. So privacy. It's the best part of my day so far, actually. But this, you know, we take privacy for granted. But what does this look like? You know, what's that space? Who inhabited that space? What city is that? It's just down the stairs from here. Whose city is that? What's made there? You know, what's the atmosphere in this city? Whose city is it? Where did it go? Who's coming back to it? Anyone? That's the city just outside our door. That's someone's city. So these are not trivial examples because they have to be strung together. They have to connect and consolidate with other affective practices. They have to resonate. They have to build. They have to slowly grow. This is the work of making a city, remaking a self, making oneself well. So the critical question is this idea of if we think about cities in terms of the distribution of capacities, then how can we encourage access to this circulation of capacities in cities? So we find here with Liz. Now Liz has been coming to the Botanical Gardens since she was a child. She grew up in South Yarra. So, you know, there is an access to circulating capacities here that comes to Liz because of her class privilege. That's not the case for Adam, certainly not the case for Mary. So how do we find ways to connect Adam, to connect Liz, others, to different kinds of capacities as they circulate in cities? So I'm going to close with really some questions. So we tend to think about homelessness and mental illness as wicked problems in cities. Sustained periods of attention to these problems, recurrent investment, all sorts of innovation, stubborn outcomes. So the crucial thing for me, as I mentioned, is when we think about problems in urban context, the thing we need to remember is, where is the city? You know, this is the city for this person. Possibly just this. on some days. This is the city. Melbourne doesn't exist anywhere else than just here for long periods of time. That's the city. How can we expand, grow, remake this city? How do we sustain this labour over time? How can we promote the circulation of social capacities? Now, I saw a really interesting presentation at a conference recently. It was about civil responses to racism on trains. And it was this idea that how do you stop that happening? And this partly was this idea of the kind of technological mediation that's happened. People can pull out their phones and film it, upload it to YouTube, and that becomes a thing in its own right. That gets picked up by the mainstream media. So now we have this sense of how racist public transport is in Melbourne. So is that a problem? Should we be concerned about that? How long has this been a problem for? Probably much longer than we've been paying attention to it. How can we respond to it? And this presentation was about the idea of what's the impulse to pull the phone out? Is that kind of promoting racism? Because oftentimes there's comments on YouTube where there's this post, the idea of put your fucking phone down and tell the person to shut up. This kind of idea. What's the response? And this person talked about this idea of how can we promote civil responses on public transport? What would be an appropriate response to that, to the event of that happening? What should we do? What's the call to action here? And the idea here is the promotion of social capacities of tolerance. How can we do that? How can we promote different kinds of responses to this? As I said, mainly I think the response to this is indifference. We simply keep walking if we notice it at all. So what kinds of responses, what would a better response to that look like? What would a healthier response to that look like? I don't know. So what mechanisms might facilitate growth and access to social, affective and material capacities? What kinds of affective labour can we promote that might help to remake that city, to remake the lives that move through that city? What sort of affective labour, what kind of work could achieve that outcome? Can we extend the right to the city, but mainly do we really want to? Do we really want to do anything about that? Now, I'm not going to get too pompous about this because I'm not doing anything either. I'm interested in it. For a time I worked in the sector and that felt like some kind of response. How much of a response, how useful that was, probably not very. But if we're really interested in solving problems in cities, what's the kind of labour that we need to consider? What do we need to commit ourselves to remake that kind of city? Thank you.